Hello everyone, my name is Chelsea Olson and I am head of the Block of the Month program for the Tehachapi Mountain Quilters. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make our very first block, which is known as the Swedish Heart Block. This block, along with all of our other blocks, will finish at 12 inches. If you happen to be a past subscriber of mine and would like to follow along, I have included the pattern in the description below. It's free. Just keep in mind that this is for one block. So if you're wanting to make an entire quilt, you will just need to multiply these cutting instructions by the number of blocks that you would like to make. So now that we've got that covered, let's talk about what you're going to need to make this block. If you purchase a kit from me, this is what you're going to be getting. If you're grabbing from your stash, you're going to need to collect from various reds and pinks, a dark, a medium, and a light, as well as a background. So let's talk about where these are in the block. For these parts of the block here, that's going to be what's in the pattern light pink and red. For those, you're going to cut one 4.5 by 8.5 inch rectangle, as well as one 2.5 by 10.5 inch strip. For these middle bits that make the two colors blend together, you're going to need two 2.5 by 10.5 inch strips. And for the background, you're going to need one 4.5 inch square, as well as four 2.5 inch squares. Don't worry if you didn't catch that. This is all at the bottom of the first page. So go ahead and collect all your pieces or get them cut, and then meet me over at the sewing machine so that we can start stitching. So now that we're over at the machine, this is my pink fabric. You're going to take one of each and sew one to your red and one to your light pink. So you'll put right sides together. It doesn't matter which is on top. You're welcome to pin if you would like. I just don't. And we are going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam. All of our seams will be sewn in this block with 1/4 inch. Now that we have the first one sewn, we're going to do the exact same thing with the red and the pink. So first, before you press them, you're going to set the seams by just placing your iron on top of the stitches you just made. Right now I have the pink color on top, and you'll just press open towards the pink. I usually just do a quick finger press after I set the seam, and then I take my iron and press it open. I don't iron like this because that will stretch. I just set it on top, and that's why I finger press, because I find it's easier to press it open if I do that first, because if not, if I'm trying to take my tip to press it open, sometimes I find that I stretch the pieces. So fingernails, and that is how I like to press. So press both seams towards your pink. You do that by placing your pink on top. Now that we have our two strip sets, we're going to need to cut them down into 2.5 inch units. So let's start with our first strip. And what I do is line up a line from my ruler along this middle seam. I trim off the edge so that it's all squared up. Then I spin it around, and we're going to need to cut 2.5 inches. So you'll find your 2.5 inch mark on your ruler and line it up with the edge. Make sure your line is actually a little bit on top of the fabric. If it's more on top of the mat, it actually makes it a little less accurate. So I like to scooch the line right on top of the edge of this fabric, and then I'm also using this line here still along that seam line to make sure everything is all nice and square. So you cut a 2.5 inch piece, and we're going to repeat this so that you get 4 units from this strip, and then we will repeat this with the other strip set. And one more. So you see here we have just enough extra so you have some wiggle room in case maybe you you know, this already kind of doesn't look square again. So what we can do is because I know it wasn't square because this edge or this line along the middle and this edge weren't lining up anymore. So you can just take your line, put it on this seam again, and then see, this is a little bit thinner than that, so it got off just a touch. So now it's square again. This will help you with more accurate piecing. So I'm once again lining up this on my 2.5 and this line on my center seam, and we're going to make our last cut. So you have plenty of room to trim. This was left over, so if you make a mistake, don't worry. And we now have our 4 pieces. And I'm going to repeat the same thing with this strip set off camera, and I'll meet you back. Now that all of our strip sets are cut down to 2.5 inch units, we are going to now sew these together. So using your diagram, right here, diagram B, we're going to sew a pink, light pink, pink, light pink together, a red, pink, light pink, pink together, pink, red, pink, light pink, and red, pink, red, pink. So we are going to sew these together at 1/4 inch, and then when you get done, you're going to press towards the pink fabric. Quick tip, one way to transfer these so you don't get confused which side to sew is you can flip these right sides together, and it doesn't have to be, can't talk with pins in my mouth. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just put a pin in the side that you're going to be sewing. If you're using pins while you sew, then I would just go ahead and do it perfectly at this stage. But this way, when you go to transfer these over, you'll make sure you sew this side instead of possibly getting it flipped and sewing it here. So this is a good way just to transfer it and hopefully not have to rip out a seam. Okay, now I'll meet you back after these are sewn. Okay, I am back from the pressing table, and just to explain this again, to press towards the pink, you put your pink on top and push it open like that. So now that we have all of these sewn together, we will look at diagram C, and you're going to take row 1 and sew it to row 2, row 3 and sew it to row 4. The way that we press towards the pink and why that's important is because now when we put these right sides together, our seams will nest, which means the seam on top is going this way and the seam on the bottom is going the other direction. So you can nest them, you can kind of wiggle them together, you can feel it just lock together, and then that way you get a perfect seam and they match up when you open them up. So you can start by getting your edges together here and putting a pin, and then I just go down, so I make sure that this seam is nested. And then I put a pin in. I make sure that this seam will nest. I'm sorry if I was just off camera. So that's nesting. And put a pin. And then this one needs to nest. Place a pin. and then this edge, if you want to pin it, you can. So we'll stitch along this side at 1/4 inch. We'll do the exact same thing with this one. And then I'm going to show you a little trick over the sewing machine. So I'll meet you over there. So now that we have both rows pinned together, we're going to stitch these with a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to get started and then remove my pin. I do not like to sew over my pins just because it can mess up the timing. Some people say if you go slow, that's fine. I just prefer not to. So however you prefer, that's a decision you'll have to make. You can also use a stiletto for this to hold this down. I'm going to do that just so you can see a little better. My hand's not blocking the view. But in case you don't want to sew over the pins like me, I try to take one stitch past this seam that we have nested before I remove my pins, because sometimes removing this pin will make it shift. So I make sure I go past that, then I pull the pin out. And then I just kind of fill my next seam and make sure, yep, that still feels nested. So then I continue on, and same thing, I'm going to go one stitch past that nested seam, or even two, and remove my pin. Check this next seam, yep, still nested, and I kind of, instead of having a pin on this side too, I really like using this stiletto. It kind of holds it like a pin would and just keeps this taut while I sew. So stiletto is really a great tool to have in your sewing collection. If this seam flips, sometimes this seam will flip up. This is helpful for sliding it back under your foot. All right, so I went past that seam, the nested seam, remove my last pin, and we are gonna sew to the end. Now that we have that one done, we will repeat the same thing with these 2 rows, and I will meet you over at the pressing station. Okay, now that we have those sewn, we are gonna press these seams. Before you press, if you wanna check to make sure that your points all match up, looks pretty good, then we can go and press. If you're not happy, go ahead, feel free to rip it out and start over again. So these in the directions say to press open. If you don't like to press seams open, that's fine. Press how you prefer. I just like to reduce the bulk on this, so I am going to press as the pattern says. So I like to finger press once again after I set the seam. And this little nifty tool is called a strip stick. And it just helps press these seams open without flipping these the wrong way. So it just keeps your previously pressed seams nice and tidy. So I usually just do that, pull it off, set it nice that way, flip it over, give it a little steam from this side. If you have a clapper, you can put that on the seam to help hold that steam in and get it really good and flat. We'll do the same thing with this. And then we are going to follow step 5. We're going to sew these two units together, and so that we'll have a finish 16 patch like in the picture. So now we're going to take a look at this. Let's see, pink, light pink, pink, light pink, red, pink, light pink. Okay, and then pink, red, yep, just like this. So you have all your lights on this side, all your darks on this side. So you'll flip them right sides together, and we will pin the same exact way we did before, nesting the seams, and stitch this together at 1/4 inch, and then our checkered 4 patch will be complete, and then we will move on to the snowballed rectangle units from here. Okay, we've now finished our 16 patch and have pressed that last seam open as well. And we'll just place it to the side with our other background square. And now we're going to make the snowball units. So to do that, you're going to take your 4.5 by 8.5 inch rectangles as well as your 2.5 inch squares. You're going to place them with right sides together up in the corners of both rectangles, just like this. And we're going to take a ruler and we're going to mark from corner to corner. So if you line your ruler up just to the left of that point, of the actual corner point, then your pencil line will land exactly on the corner and it will be a perfect drawn line. So same thing, I'm going to move the ruler just a smidge to the left so that my pencil line can go perfectly from point to point. You can use a marking pencil and a air erase or water erase. If you just draw really lightly with a regular pencil, that's fine too. So we are now going to take these, I already drew these earlier, we're going to take these to the sewing machine and stitch directly on these lines. Now back over at the sewing machine, if you want to throw a pin in these, you can to kind of hold them together. I just hold it in place. I think it does just fine without a pin. So the lines we drew are actually the stitching lines, and what I like to do is actually move my needle over just a touch. With mine I can even do this with the single needle hole plate, but we're going to be stitching on this line, so I'm going to move my needle to the right just one position, and then that way when I go to sew, it's just to the right of that stitching line. I like to do this because the thread actually takes up space when you press it, and sometimes when you fold your corner back, it doesn't quite reach where your where the corner of the red would have been. So your block ends up just a touch smaller. So that's why I like to just sew. If your machine doesn't move to the right, then just eyeball it and just stitch right next to that drawn line. And you want to always go to the side that you're going to be cutting away. So we're going to be cutting away this corner. So that's the side that I sew to, basically closer to the seam allowance side. Another fun thing you can do, little trick, is after you've sewn this seam, you could mark a 1/2 inch away from that sewn line and stitch along that line as well. And this time, since my seam allowance is going to be to the left, I'm going to go just to the left of that drawn line. And then what we can do is we cut this seam allowance away. We have a 1/4 inch seam on each side, and we have an extra little 1/2 square triangle instead of throwing that in the trash. I'm just going to continue to sew all of these the exact same way. I'm going to speed this up so that you're not bored to death. I'm going to turn my light back on so that I can see what I'm doing. And again, stitch just to the left because that will be the seam allowance. So just to the left of that drawn line. Now that these blocks are completed, we will trim away these outside corners. You can do this with a ruler and a rotary cutter as well. I just find it's quicker to do it with the scissors and it doesn't have to be perfect. So this is how I do it. And then you're just going to go to the ironing board and you're going to set the seam first, and then you'll just roll these back
and press them out like that for both blocks.
Quick note, do you have to make these triangles out of the corner? Absolutely not. You can throw them away if you like. I just like to collect that and thought it would be a fun little tip for you. And another note about the whole like sewing to the left or the right of the drawn line, if that's confusing you, just stitch on the drawn line. That's just more of a tip for some of the more advanced people who are watching the class. I have stitched these together and I have went ahead and laid the block out the way that the pattern says, with our background square, our light pink, our red, and our checkered 16 patch. So you want to make sure that this is turned the right direction, where your reds are touching the red side and your light pinks are touching the light pink side. So now we're going to stitch these two together here and then those two together here. The nice thing about this seam is there's no seams to match along here or along here. You just want to make sure that you don't accidentally flip your seam allowances the wrong way, so just be careful of that, but it will be a very easy seam to sew. All right, those seams have been sewn, and then I just followed the pattern. It has the pressing directions here, so I pressed the seams towards the red, so I put this red on top, pressed it this way. It says to press towards the light pink, so I put this on top, pressed it open. And now we just have to sew this last seam and we're all done. So you put right sides together and then you only have one seam to match. We'll nest this seam, pin it. We'll just stitch that, and then I like to press the seam open when I'm done just to help reduce the bulk in this block. All right, everyone, so this is the completed block after you finish that seam and press it open on the back. It's, like I said, a 12-inch finished block, so right now it should measure 12.5 inches. But I hope you have enjoyed following along for our very first block of the month tutorial. I have had a little difficulties trying to figure out this video situation, so I apologize for sound and video quality and content, but I'm sure as this goes along I will get better as well. So hopefully that doesn't scare you away from watching the tutorials, and I hope you have enjoyed making this block as much as I have. And if you are in the guild, make sure to bring this block to the March meeting and we will do a drawing for it. So the pattern will be in the February newsletter. If you are signed up on the email list, I will send out an email with the pattern and a link to this video. So I look forward to continuing this series, and we'll work through you learning to sew and me learning to make videos together. So we'll see you next month. Thanks. Bye.